Anyway, today, like I said, I'm moving on. I've got to finish up first talking about the Roman period. I'll kind of talk about what happened to the Roman Empire itself. I'm going to, of course, be talking about, of course, a few things today right now. I'll get into, and I'll first talk about, I think we had kind of gotten into, and we discussed what happened with the fall of the Western Empire, which I think we had talked about how the West started getting overrun by all these different barbarian groups that came in. Let me go ahead and first talk about that today, about what happened with that. We had already talked about how these different Germanic peoples had entered. I think we already went through them, I know, and talked about it before, but I told you how you had these different groups that came in that took over mostly the West. I told you how the Visigoths came in. They took over Spain. The Vandals took over North Africa. Ostrogoths took over Italy. The Franks eventually took over, of course, France. Then the Anglo-Saxons came in and took over like where Britain is today, like England, all that. So all that fell to them. And I think at the end, I started talking about the Huns and all that. The Huns came in too as well. Now, I think I kind of went into the Huns a little bit already. I think I told you how the Huns, and you saw in the video, the Huns were these nomadic people that fought on horseback, kind of like the Mongols later, who came out of close to Mongolia. And they basically migrated westward, like across Russia into Asia. They ended up in where Hungary and Austria is today, like where Budapest is, the capital of Hungary now today. And they eventually formed an empire called the Hanukk Empire. I think I mentioned this already a little bit about this. And I think I told you how the Huns were very warlike and pagan. They weren't really Christian. And they were led by this man named Attila, who, of course, everybody now calls Attila the Hun. And Attila was considered to be one of the greatest rulers of the Huns. He was pretty much the peak ruler of the Hanukk Empire, which they used the term Pannonia. Pannonia was a term that was actually a province that was very close to the Danube River, like around where close to Hungary is in Austria. And some people call it that, the Hanukk Empire. But the Hanukk Empire stretched from like Central Europe all the way to like close to Russia in the Ukraine. So it was a pretty huge empire. What Attila is famous for, his armies eventually attacked the Roman Empire, like both of them, the Eastern and the Western Roman empires. And so his state was kind of like a parasite to the Romans. In fact, they would actually demand that the Romans pay them like exorbitant amount of like gold tribute. And if they didn't, they would get attacked. And so Attila grew very rich off of that. And he was able to amass a huge army. And eventually what happened was Attila, of course, attacked the Eastern Roman Empire first, if you know about this, in the early, I think, 440s CE. And you can see actually that map shows you like the route of where they took, like the first attack, you can see came down through Greece right there. That green lines are coming down into Greece from where it says the Hun capital. And what happened was the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, fared better than the West. They had better armies. They also had better fortifications, and it got so bad that the Romans in the East built extensive fortifications on the western side of Constantinople, like the Theodosian Wall, which is probably is famous today, still there. It was built there because of Attila, to keep him out, all of that. Then Attila attacked the West, like the Western Roman Empire, which he started in 451 CE. And his forces amassed a huge army, crossed the Rhine River into France, which, of course, the Romans called Gaul at the time. And the Romans were forced to call up a huge army to try to stop Attila. which included like actually a mix of Roman and Germanic forces. Federati, the Federati, which is what they called the German mercenaries that fought under the Romans, auxiliary troops. And I think it was mostly Germans that fought actually in it. And it led to a battle called, you would call it the Battle of Chalons, or some people call it the Catalonian Plains or Catalonian Fields, which took place on June 20th, 451. And the Attila's forces were actually beaten back and forced back into Germany at that point. And without the German troops, they probably would have lost the Romans. And really that battle, Chalons or Catalonian Fields, is considered really to be the last major victory of the Roman Empire in the West. They don't pretty much win any battles after that overall. So yeah, he almost conquered Gaul or France at that point, Attila, and then Attila then attacked Italy, like in 452. In the next year, went after Italy, and actually devastated the northern regions of Italy, sacked and destroyed several cities, I think including where Venice is today, was sacked. And what happened was they believed that the reason why Attila eventually abandoned his conquest of Italy was because of the Pope of the Catholic Church came out to meet Attila. And Pope Leo the Great, also called Leo the First, apparently met with him and somehow talked him into leaving Italy, like ending his campaign or whatever. And they're not sure why. There's been a big debate about what Pope Leo the Great said to Attila to basically, turn him around. Some people think he may have been bribed. That was the real reason for it, but they don't really know. It's kind of a mystery about that, about what happened with Attila. Attila mysteriously died in 453. A very strange event, but he got married to this younger woman. And on his wedding night, he evidently drank too much, and he died from some kind of nosebleed. Just kind of weird. He actually drowned in his own blood when his nose bled. Yeah, seriously. And anyway, after that, his empire, his Hanukk Empire, collapsed. It fell apart, and it never got back together. But they do think that the attacks by Attila into the Roman Empire helped to contribute to why the whole Roman Empire fell. And then they eventually, in the 5th century, like more into the later part of the 5th century, the Roman Empire does collapse in the West. And that, of course, occurs when in 476 CE, the last Roman emperor in the West stepped down. He abdicated, who was he's either called Romulus Augustus, but a lot of people call him Romulus Augustulus, which is a nickname that means Little Augustus, or Little August, really. And the Germans in Italy forced him to basically step down. And so what that meant basically was that there were no more Roman emperors in the West that were actually recognized by pretty much the Germans that were taking over the West. And so 476, that became the popular date when the so-called Western Roman Empire fell. When the empire kind of collapses at that point, breaks up. And Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire back in the 18th century, is the one that kind of helped, make that date 476 kind of popular with that. Yeah, they would have the Eastern, you can see in the East in that map there, the Eastern Roman Empire would continue. So they would continue in the East, and then the West was just carved up, by all these different Germanic peoples that came in afterwards. And so the Western central part of, Europe and all that, that becomes what we call medieval Europe, or the Middle Ages, or the medieval period that comes in afterwards. And all these different Germanic peoples created all these different states that were basically part of the former Roman Empire and all that. And the Byzantine Empire is actually around to 1453, but over time it shrinks. It becomes smaller and smaller until it's really not much of a state the Roman Empire isn't really what it was after that, you know, when the western part broke away. Just that's it. So anyway, so yeah, that pretty much ends the whole, you know, Roman Empire. Of course, I'm going to, of course, for a few minutes, I am going to go ahead and review a little bit. I've got some review questions I can kind of go over, of course, about the Roman Empire, which we haven't really covered yet at this point, but I'll go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to move on, of course, to get into, of course, the early Middle Ages today also. Now, Kat, I think, of course, I'll go through some of these questions we talked about already before. So, yeah, what were these emperors famous for? Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. Those are known as the five good emperors, or the part of the period of the five good emperors, which was the peak of the Pax Romana. Nerva was the one that started it. He's the one that founded the so-called Nerva dynasty, which included Nerva, Trajan, and Hadrian. They were all in it. And Nerva is the one that started the whole adoption process, where a lot of the emperors at the time started adopting each other and all that. Trajan was a Roman general. He was from Spain. So was Hadrian. And Trajan was known for his expansionism. He conquered like the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And he took over like Dacia, part of the Black Sea region. Iraq was conquered under him, part of it. And then also, I think he also conquered part of like where Jordan is today as well. Trajan was also known for Trajan's Forum in Rome. Hadrian, of course, was another Spanish general adopted by Trajan. He was kind of a military mind, like he was as well. Hadrian was known as the Greekling. Remember, he was one that was called that because of the fact that he was known for being a patron of the arts, especially Greek culture, and he was an amateur architect. Hadrian's the one who built Hadrian's Wall in the northern part of Rome and Britain to block barbarians from invading it. He also built the Pantheon Temple. Was another thing he was famous for in Rome. Antoninus Pius, of course, was another emperor. He was the so-called third good emperor. Actually, I'm sorry, the fourth good emperor. Antoninus Pius was the third longest reigning emperor, reigning about 23 years, a little bit shorter than Tiberius. And Antoninus Pius was known for founding the Antonine Dynasty, which included himself, Marcus Aurelius, the brother Lucius Verus, brother of Marcus Aurelius, and then Commodus was also in it. Antoninus Pius' reign was considered to be the peak of the Pax Romana, when it was like, the most peaceful overall. Marcus Aurelius was the last of the five good emperors. He was considered one of the greatest emperors of the 2nd century. He was the one that was known as a Stoic philosopher. Stoicism was famous for his book he wrote. It was more like a diary or journal that was known as the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, or just Meditations for short. Marcus Aurelius was also known for fighting in a lot of wars. He fought in the Marcomannic Wars, which was fought against the Germans over the Danube River Valley, like around Hungary and Austria. And he also fought, his brother, Lucius Verus, was involved in the Roman Parthian Wars, fighting like in Syria and Iraq. What emperor ended this period, and likely the Pax Romana, when he took power as a tyrannical ruler? That was Commodus, who was the son of Marcus Aurelius. He was, of course, the last of the Antonine Dynasty. What is the year when some believe the Pax Romana ended? 180 CE. Who and what dynasty seized control of Rome by 193? That was the Severan dynasty came to power. It, of course, was founded by Roman general Septimius Severus, who was a general under Commodus. He and his family reigned until about, I think it's 235. I don't know if you have to know as much about them, but they did have like, I think Severus had his famous wife talked about, which was Julia Domna, who was, of course, a famous empress consort. Also, he had his two sons reigned as well, which were Geta and Caracalla as well. I think the other ones aren't as important, though, the later emperors. What historical period in the 3rd century almost calls the collapse of the Roman Empire? They had, of course, the whole so-called crisis period or anarchy period that happens in the 3rd century, where the Roman Empire almost collapsed due to internal, like, civil war between the different rival emperors. And the emperors that took power, which were like something like almost 30, like 50 years, from 235 to about 284, were sometimes called the barracks emperors or soldier emperors because of the fact that they came out of the military or were controlled by the military. One emperor ended this period and began stabilizing Rome with his various reforms. That was, of course, Diocletian, who came in. Yeah, Diocletian. Diocletian was the one that created a bunch of reforms to the state, which he was, of course, known for. Now, what political reform divided the empire into 4 parts with a Western Eastern Roman Empire? That was eventually called the Tetrarchy, which was a Roman government where you had 4 emperors that reigned. They were called tetrarchs. And the 4 rulers were basically called, like the top ones, the ones that were the 2 most important. They had a Western Augustus and they had an Eastern Augustus. So you had 2 main emperors that ruled both the East and the West. And they had 2 emperors that were below them, kind of like a vice emperor, which were called a Caesar. So you had a Western Caesar and you had an Eastern Caesar. Chat. What was the Diacliniatic Persecution? It was like a period of from about 10 years, from about 303 to 313, where the Roman Empire began a mass persecution of Christians throughout the empire. It was an attempt to try to save the traditional Roman religions, or now we call it paganism, as a whole. And several thousand may have been killed. I think they're not sure. They think it's exaggerated how many it was, but the Catholic Church called it the Great Persecution, all that. But it may have been exaggerated because it wasn't exactly even the persecution, throughout the empire. That one right there, I think that's kind of the one on the bottom's kind of, we don't really need to do. I already did that one. But which Roman leader eventually ended the Tetrarchy after civil wars broke out between the various rulers? Actually, it's probably just 3, but that was, of course, the famous Roman general and emperor later, Constantine the Great. Constantine, of course, would do that next. And Constantine, of course, went on to become the one that would adopt Christianity. So what religion did he eventually adopt during the wars of the Tetrarchy? That was, of course, Christianity. So he became the first Christian emperor. It's debated about when he converted. Some believe that he actually converted on his deathbed and not really at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. So I don't know about that. But what did the Edict of Milan establish under Roman rule? That was something that, of course, Constantine the Great was known for issuing in 313. What that did was it basically made like the Roman, it made Christianity like an official religion of the Roman Empire. And it effectively ended the persecutions of Christians throughout the Roman Empire. What was the First Council of Nicaea? First Council of Nicaea was a ecumenical church council of the early Christian church, which met in 325 in like northern Turkey. And what it did was it meted out all the different reforms of the church, which included like church laws, like canon laws, what the Bible was going to be. It banned certain heretical forms of Christianity. So those are just different things that it basically did. Even established, of course, certain kinds of, like holidays within the church and all of that. And I think I told you that the big things it did was it banned Aryan Christianity. Was one thing it did. They adopted the Trinity. They also added the Nicene Creed, which is a Christian prayer of faith, into the Mass, which forced Christians to say that they believe in the Trinity. Also, they adopted the New Testament, which was compiled, right after. What famous city did Constantine found? He founded, of course, Constantinople, which became like the new capital of the Roman Empire, established in 330. Where was it established? It was founded, of course, in Western Turkey on the European side, south of the Black Sea. It's actually located on a peninsula near the Sea of Marmara, which is right below the Black Sea. What empire later merged in the east with the city as its main capital? That, of course, was the Eastern Roman Empire, which people later called the Byzantine Empire, or Byzantine, if you want to say it that way as well, which the name was derived from an ancient Greek city called Byzantium, where the city was built on top of. And Istanbul is the modern name. Of course, they now call it today. Was there with Theodosius the Great famous for as a ruler of the Roman Empire? Two things, I guess, big about him. One was Theodosius was the one that it was the last sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He actually reigned over both halves, which was like in the 390s CE. And then because of that, he was able to eventually convert the whole Roman Empire to Nicene Christianity. And so Theodosius I, or Theodosius the Great, was the emperor that basically made the Roman Empire into a Christian state. He was one of the first to do that. And he also banned the Olympics because it was, considered pagan, all that. What was the cause of the decline of the Western Roman Empire? I think I already talked about this already before, but basically the Roman Empire was caused by a lot of things, the decline, but the main thing, of course, that caused it, of course, was the invasion of the barbarians, like the different Germanic peoples and other people that invaded the Roman Empire. That's what they called barbarians. And I told you the different Germanic peoples that entered the Roman Empire were like the I told you about the Goths, right? The Goths was one group that invaded. The Visigoths, were famous for sacking Rome in 410. They also, of course, took over Spain and created the Visigothic kingdom. Ostrogoths also took over Italy. They had the Ostrogothic kingdom. The Vandals conquered Carthage, like North Africa, and they sacked Rome too, 455, the Vandals. The Vandals were famous for their kingdom called the Vandalic Kingdom. The Franks took over Gaul, which became France, of course, later. And then I told you about the Anglo-Saxons, like the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, which came out of Northern Europe, took over Britain, of course. And then the Foederati. The Foederati, of course, was a Roman term they used for auxiliary troops that fought under the Roman Empire, especially in the West. And most of them, of course, were composed of Germans, just about, because by the end of the Roman Empire, the West especially, most of them were mercenaries that were German. And then I talked about the Huns already. The Huns, of course, were these nomadic Asiatic peoples from close to Mongolia that, of course, spread westward into Central Europe. And they're the ones under Attila the Hun that would, of course, attack the Roman Empire and help contribute to why it collapsed, of course, later. And the other stuff I see on there on the bottom, I've already pretty much done all that other stuff today. So I'll probably just go ahead and skip that. And I'm going to, of course, move on next to talk about, of course, I need to get, of course, into the early Middle Ages today, which I will talk about first. And I think mostly I'll have time to maybe talk about the Franks. I know I'll get into them, about who they were. And if I have any time, I'll maybe start talking about the Vikings, if I do have time, more or less. So anyway, Simon West. Oh, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I'm doing a lecture, of course, for a class right now, which I'm recording right now. So anyway, so we're talking about the medieval ages, the Middle Ages right now, of course, 500 to 1500, more or less. And the Middle Ages, of course, was a period from about, it usually is rounded off from about 500 to about 1500, which is really just an average amount of time. That's usually what they round it off to, although the Middle Ages really goes back further than that. I think most historians seem to think that the Middle Ages starts roughly around about maybe, I would say you could go all the way back to the time of the period of the five good emperors, like around the time of maybe Marcus Aurelius, etc., because that's the time where you have the Marco-Manic Wars, where the Germans start trying to invade like into the Roman Empire, of course, in the West. And the Middle Ages is called all kinds of names. Of course, medieval period, medieval times. Of course, you often hear that name being used a lot. And it starts really from the fall of the Western Empire in the West with the Romans, and it goes all the way up to the time of the Renaissance period, when we have of course, early modern times that comes in. The term medieval is a term that means middle age. That's actually what it means. It's where the term originated from, which goes back to, I think, around the Renaissance. It's basically a between period, is what it is. In fact, it's what it means. Middle age or between age, basically. And so it's this between period that's kind of between what is the Roman Empire, of course, that fell in the West, and then, of course, the Renaissance that starts in the 1300s, 14th century. And the other term they use for medieval times, of course, is also called the so-called medieval Dark Ages, which start, around that time. And the Italian writer Petrarch, who they think helped start the Renaissance in the 14th century, is the one that coined the term Dark Ages to describe, of course, the medieval period and all of that. Petrarch is later, considered one of the humanists that would start, of course, the Middle Ages later, the Renaissance later in the late Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages usually put in a certain order, like, of course, get into it. Historians have kind of broken it down into different sub-periods, more or less. I'll kind of go into it real quick here, but the Middle Ages usually broken down into three periods. You have the early Middle Ages, which started around 500 to about 1000. The early Middle Ages is mostly a period where what mostly happened during that time was you have the period where the Roman Empire is collapsing at that point, mostly in the West, and then you have the rise of like the Franks that basically start coming in and taking over mostly Western Europe. You also have the Vikings come in, like the Viking era kind of starts at the end of the early Middle Ages, roughly, I guess, around close to 800 or around the 9th century is about when that is. High Middle Ages from about 1000 to 1300, also sometimes called the Central Middle Ages as well. It was kind of like the peak of it, which is why it's called that. High Middle Ages is a period where you see the rise of like a lot of the big powers like England, France, Holy Roman Empire kind of starts to emerge in Europe. And then, and of course, you got the period of the Crusades, which start at that same time in the late part of the 11th century anyway. And then the later Middle Ages, of course, starts in the 14th century. That kind of goes up to roughly 1500s, even into, some people think the Middle Ages even goes up to like close to like early 1600s in some places in parts of Europe. The late Middle Ages, of course, is known for like the main things that happened that time was, of course, the Renaissance is the most dominant event that happened historically in the late Middle Ages. The Black Death, about that, which happened mostly around the 14th century, wiped out a good chunk of the population. I might even talk about the 100 Years' War, which is one of the most famous wars that happened, of course, in the Middle Ages, more or less. Now, what was the medieval period like exactly cultural-wise? Well, it was a mix of different cultures. At least I can give you three things that was the most famous that was kind of there that they had. It's mostly a mix of Germanic culture with Roman culture. So that's pretty much what you have throughout medieval times. You have mostly the Germanic people that are there, and then you even have a melding of the population where you've got deals where people intermarrying, like Germans with Roman people, more or less. Like in Gaul, you have these Gaelic Roman people that you see emerging there as an example. And then, of course, you got to, of course, mix in there, of course, the Roman Catholic Church and its influences, throughout Europe pretty much. And so it's really a mix of those things. Also, other cultures, like in Spain, you've got the Moors that come in Also in parts of like we have Hungarian peoples and things like that, Magyars and so on that kind of enter Europe too, like in Central Europe as well there, but they're probably not as big of an influence. But over time, Catholicism will be the main religion throughout most of Europe, you know, from Spain, England, France, all the way to like pretty much Poland. It's pretty much all just about Catholic, at least until the Reformation would occur, like in the 1500s. So now talk about the medieval world itself. Yeah, in the medieval world, there were different states that emerged after the fall of the Roman Empire. Like in the West, they had all these different states that were set up by the Germans that came in. You've got, you know, the Visigoths, I told you, in Spain that were established, which they were later wiped out by the Moors. Anglo-Saxons, of course, in Britain, which that later led to the development of the Kingdom of England over time. Ostrogothic, they were later conquered, though, the Ostrogoths, though. Vandalic kingdom was later wiped out by Justinian, his armies, later with the Byzantine Empire around the 6th century. And then Islam would come in and just take over most of North Africa, of course, later as well. Now, in Western Europe, the Franks, though, emerged as the big power overall. I told you about the Franks before. The Franks were these Germans that, of course, originated from northern Germany, east of the Rhine River. And they became a very powerful state in the early Middle Ages. In fact, if you read about the Franks, they're really the first major Catholic medieval state that forms after the fall of the Roman Empire. They had settled there way back in the 5th century, like in what they call Gaul, which is what the Romans called it a long time ago. There was a Roman historian that wrote about the early Franks. That's where we get a lot of our history from, about the Franks. That's Gregory of Tours, which you may have heard of. He wrote the history of the Franks. That's where we get a lot of our information about the Merovingians and their dynasty that will rule over the Franks for about almost 300 years. And Gregory of Tours was like this Gaelic Roman historian. He was kind of a mix. Like I'm saying, all these people that are kind of a mix of Roman and, you know, Gaelic, you know, German that you've got living in that part of Europe at the time. And it was written in Latin. Gregory of Tours, of course, was a Christian monk. I think he says that he wasn't that great of a writer, I think, when he wrote, because at the time, a lot of the only people that could really read Latin at the time were pretty much in the Catholic Church in the West. And so people were not very well learned like they were previously under the Roman period. And but he talks about the Merovingians, this dynasty that would seize power in what is Western Europe, France and other parts of like Germany. And the Merovingians were one of two dynasties of the Franks that would, of course, come to power. The other one, of course, was called the Carolingian Dynasty that would rule later. And they're the ones that would start this state, which they actually called it Francia, of course, which meant like the kingdom of the Franks. And started in 481, you can see there. And it had a founder named Clovis I. He founded the actual state in the late 5th century. Clovis was actually a grandson of this king named Merovich. Merovich had been some kind of Frankish king that had helped the Romans defeat Attila when he invaded Gaul in the mid-5th century. And so the name Merovingian was kind of adopted from his name. In fact, the name Merovingian is a name that means the sons of or descendants of Merovich. It's actually what it means. I don't know if you know much about Louisiana State University, like in Louisiana, but there's a famous basketball player you may have heard of named Pete Maravich. They called him Pistol Pete. And the name Maravich is a variation of the name Merovich, like from that old German name that's where it came from. But yeah, this dynasty would go on to be pretty powerful. They actually would be empowered until about the mid-8th century CE. So they're in power, I think, like 270 something years or something like that, that they're in power. Oh, also the name Clovis, if you see that name, it's a Latin name that, by the way, means Louis. And you know, all the French kings that with the name Louis that they have later, that's where the name originally came from. So you take the C off and you take the V and make it into a U. It spells Louis, or Louis, if you want to say it that way, also as well. The Merovingian kings, by the way, had a nickname. They were called the long-haired kings. They were called this because all of them had long hair, of course. And supposedly it was a symbol of their power. So they actually, the king got his hair cut off. He didn't have any power anymore, and all that. And but yeah, they would be in power a long time. But over time, they would actually become like figureheads. And I'll get to it later. But they have these aristocratic rulers that take over later that are called a major domo. That has really more power than they do over time. By the way, the Merovingians they didn't just have France, you know, where the Franks were and all that originally. Their empire would eventually expand to control not just France, but the area like what we call, you know, Bavaria, Rhineland, which is in like western and southern Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, all those areas at one point they would control. Oh, and also you can add that list, Italy. Most of Italy was eventually controlled by them as well. So their empire eventually became much larger later, which it became later an empire, but it became much larger than the Byzantine one in Eastern Europe, you know, and all that, and in the East. Now, let me get into and talk about first Clovis. We haven't really talked about him a little bit because I just kind of mentioned a little bit about him. Clovis is important because not only is he the founder of the Merovingian Dynasty, and it would be, I guess, the kingdom of the Franks. Clovis is the one that actually converted. He was the first king, really, in the West to convert to Catholicism in the medieval period. This happened in the year 496. Supposedly the story behind this is that he was talked into converting to Catholicism from his wife. I think her name was Clotilda. And then he basically got all of his, I think in the middle of a river, they converted. He took all of his soldiers and made them all convert. And then from there, basically, they began to convert everybody else, you know, to that same Catholicism, same Christian religion. Before that, they were Christian, but it was like a form of like, you know, that heretical form I talked about called Aryan Christianity, which a lot of people in the West kind of practice. It was kind of popular. And so they helped to kind of get rid of that and bring in the Nicene Christianity form, of course, which will be Catholicism later. So that's why Clovis is big, why he's important, and all that. Now, let me get into next and talk about the different the major domo that'll come in afterwards and become more powerful. Yeah, the kings become figureheads, like I said. Like between the 7th and 8th centuries, over time, the Merovingians eventually become, the kings become kind of weak, and they get taken over by these royal officials, which really more like aristocratic type rulers that were known as a major domo, also called the mayor of the palace, as they're called, which means actually major domo could mean like mayor of the palace, or actually could mean house if you want. So what it can actually translate as meaning. And they started out as these officials that ran the palace, is what they did, like the king's household and all that. And then over time, what happened with the major domos is that they effectively became like warlords. They were kind of like a shogun, or a cross between a shogun really and a prime minister. Would be kind of like what they would be today. And so the king would have like ceremonial duties, and then the major domo had control of the state, the military, and he pretty much controlled all the policies, all that. The most famous major domos were the Pippinids, which you may have heard of. These were a Frankish aristocratic family that ruled as major domos between the 7th and the 8th centuries. They came from an area called Austrasia, which was an area, I guess would be like kind of like northern Germany, around where the Netherlands is, and Belgium and Luxembourg. That would be about the area of what they called Austrasia. And over time, they'd get so powerful that they would become eventually kings in right. Of course, the most famous they had as a major domo was Charles Martel, who eventually became one of their leaders. And Martel is a nickname. It means the hammer. In fact, his actual Latin name is Carolus Martellus, which means Charles or Carl, if you want, the hammer. Yeah, that's where the word Carl comes from. And or also in Spain, they say Carlos as well. And he was mostly a general. He was very famous for being a very great general of the Franks. But he, over time, would become known as a pretty good statesman as well. And he's mostly famous for his military successes that he had against the Moors, who invaded from Spain into France, which I'll talk a little bit about today. Who are the Moors? The Moors were basically people that are related to people from Morocco, or we call them Moorish peoples, or Moors for short. And they're actually a mix of peoples. I think that the theory that they're mostly a kind of a mix of Arab, Berber, African, etc., maybe related back to some of the other peoples that were there before, like maybe Phoenicians even that were there before, I know, in that region. They're kind of a mix of peoples from North Africa. And over time, what happened was they conquered Spain, which is the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal is today. They actually wiped out the Visigothic kingdom that was there. They took that area over from them and formed a state there. And over time, what happened was they then marched over the Pyrenees from Spain into France. And they tried to invade France in the 730s. And of course, what happened was Martel, with his forces, eventually routed them in several battles. The most famous was in 732 October, called the Battle of Tours. It's called, where Frankish forces, which were mostly infantry, they're outnumbered heavily by the Moors, who were mostly fought on horseback, eventually defeated them and forced them back into Spain. So-called Battle of Tours, it was called. And the Battle of Tours was important because it cemented Frankish power in Western Europe. Like, basically, it allowed them to basically take part of Spain, which I think eventually they would take over like the eastern part of Spain, control all of France, and then pretty much controlled most of Western Europe. And it also helped to preserve the Catholic faith, because I think there's a story where Adolf Hitler believed that if the Moors would have won, they would have conquered all of Europe. Now, seriously, Hitler was interested about that story. I was reading about it a while back. He was kind of fascinated about the Moors. Anyway, the belief was if the Martel would have lost, Islam would have spread across Europe. And so you would not have had the Catholic faith, from Spain all the way to Poland, like I was talking about. So that was kind of a turning point in history, in medieval Europe at the time. Martel also had a son named Pepin, or Pippin. We call him also too as well, from the name Pippinids. Pepin the Third. They called it Pepin the Short because he was short. Anyway, a lot of these guys all had nicknames, the Franks, like just about all of them did. But so Pepin, he came in next, and he was another major domo, and he was known for eventually seizing control of the actual kingdom of the Franks, like outright, more or less, because like I said, I told you the kings were kind of figureheads. And he got the backing from the Pope at the time. And so he would actually take over the state, and they would become, of course, the kings. And he would start his own dynasty, which would be named after his father, Charles Martel, or Carolus Magnus, which became known as the Carolingian Dynasty, is what they would call it, from the Latin name, Carolus, from Charles, of course, his name. And he would, of course, after he would die, his son would come in, which, of course, I'm going to talk about next, who's really more famous than he is. of course, who is, of course, known as Charlemagne. And, of course, that's the big thing we'll talk about today, about Charlemagne. And Charlemagne, of course, became basically the greatest king of the Franks. He was later known, of course, as an emperor. Of course, he would be crowned by the Catholic Church in the West. And he would take the Frankish state, he actually doubled it in size. He got, double the size it was, and would stretch it further into Germany, into Italy. And they called it different names. A lot of people just call it Charlemagne's Empire because it never really had an official name to it. But they usually call it the Carolingian Empire. That's the common name that they now call it, I guess, historians today. They called it Francia, this empire that would form. And yeah, he was considered one of the greatest medieval kings, like in the medieval times. The guy reigned almost 50 years that he was in power. He was considered one of the greatest rulers at that time. Huge guy, too. He's like 6'4". He's a huge man, Charlemagne. And the reason why we know a little bit about him is because there was a Christian monk and writer at the time named Einhard. He actually wrote a biography about Charlemagne that was called The Life of Charles or Life of Charlemagne, which was, they think, written sometime right after Charlemagne died. Einhard was actually Charlemagne's personal secretary, so he knew him quite well. And so he's kind of an important source in learning a lot about who Charlemagne was and all of that. And the thing that Charlemagne's known for, he's the one that spread Christianity to most of Western Europe. Christians, of course, called him different names. He was called Iron Charles, the right arm of God. They called him this because of the fact that he was seen as this guy that was a patron of Christianity, that spread the religion. The time, if you didn't convert to Christianity, like especially then, you could often be put to death for it. They could call it baptism by the sword. That's what some people called it. And so, yeah, everywhere he went, he built like churches and cathedrals, and he was a big patron of the arts and literature at the time. So he was really trying to kind of restore culture and learning throughout, trying to end the Dark Ages, at that time. There's a famous story where on Christmas Day, 800, some people think it's kind of more of a legend, but they say that Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope, Leo III, as emperor. The Pope at that point realized that his empire, his state, was becoming an empire that was almost comparable to the former Western Roman Empire. And so the church had this idea that basically, let's create this new Western Roman Empire. And that's kind of what they were trying to do. And I think the church wanted to do this because they wanted to have this, rival state to the Byzantine Empire that was in the East, because they had their own church, which is the Orthodox Church. And the Catholic Church viewed the Franks as like their savior, the people that could protect them and all that. And so that's why he kind of recognized him. I think he was shocked when they crowned him. He didn't think it was coming, I guess, that kind of thing. But basically, it was really not a Roman Empire. It was more like a Germanic version, I guess, of the Western Roman Empire, with the Franks ruling it. That's kind of what it was, or the idea of it. And Charlemagne's important because they usually view Charlemagne as the father of Europe, because he helps to establish not just some of the countries that will be created in Europe, but also the separation of it that will happen later over time. Like France and Germany will basically emerge later to kind of break away from it. Like the Kingdom of France, of course, will form in the West. Central Europe, you've got, Germany will kind of form over time, which they say formed out of the Holy Roman Empire, which was the nickname of what they called Germany in medieval times and later in early modern times. And usually Charlemagne is kind of seen as the founder of the Holy Roman Empire. What happened after Charlemagne died? Well, like I said, Charlemagne reigned until his son took. Actually, his son co-ruled with him. He had a son named Louis the Pious. He was called the Pious because he was very religious, very pro-Catholic, and so his son took over. He reigned quite a long time, to about 840 CE. But what happened was he became senile, and his sons basically started infighting over the whole empire. I think they took him and they put him in a monastery, got rid of him. And over time, they ended up in a civil war with each other, which the three main sons that ended up fighting over the whole thing were Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German. It's the German name later, Germany. And so they ended up fighting over the whole thing. And after about 3 years, from about 840 to 843, all those sons fighting over it, they eventually broke it up. They broke up the whole former empire of Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire. It was actually broken up into 3 different states. And so the states they actually broke it up into were called the Western Francia, Middle Francia, and Eastern Francia. Real fancy names there. That's actually what they called it, and they broke it up and all that. And that's interesting about that, because that's where you end up with all this. You look at Europe and all that, how you have all the countries the way they are now, like in Western Central Europe. It's pretty much how that all came about, later. Like in Western France, that became France, pretty much. So you have England above that. Of course, the Normans will go into, England later. Germany, of course, in the eastern part of Francia, of course, will break away. Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland's kind of in the middle of that, that you also have as well. So you get the separation, of all these different states that eventually form because of what happened, with Charlemagne. I do have some further pictures here. You can see that's the size of Charlemagne's empire overall that was created. What you see goes from like part of Spain, like the eastern part of it, through France. You can see up through Saxony, down through Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Bavaria, and then into Italy. So this empire was pretty massive in size. It was, I think, eventually bigger than the Byzantine Empire, of course, in the east and all that. There's Einhard, who supposedly wrote the Life of Charlemagne. Everywhere, of course, Charlemagne went, he built, like I said, churches and cathedrals. That, of course, is the one in Aachen that he built, Western Germany. That, of course, was bombed by the Germans in World War II. And, of course, a lot of these churches were kind of rebuilt later, after the war. Right. I need to, of course, move on. Of course, I'm going to next talk about I've got a few minutes left. I'll at least start on it and talk about the Viking period that comes in next. So I need to get to that as well. Yeah, the Vikings, I kind of just started kind of mentioning a little bit about the Vikings a little bit. So I'm going to talk about the background of the Vikings for you as well, about who they were more or less. The Vikings would come in about the 9th and 11th century. I think I told you that maybe around close to 900, that range. It's about when they start coming in. It's often called different names: Viking Age, Viking Era. It's all called all kinds of different names. The invasion of the Vikings, you want to call it that as well. But in parts of like Northern Europe, where Scandinavia is, you have peoples that basically leave there and they invade, of course, different parts of Europe and also into the North Atlantic. We go into there as well and attack as well. The Vikings originated from mostly 3 main areas of today that you know about: Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Denmark's right above Germany. And above the Baltic Sea, you've got, of course, Norway on the western side of Scandinavia, then Sweden. You also got Finland, but Finland wasn't really a kingdom or anything at the time, and all of that. And they are called different names, the Vikings. Of course, Norsemen were the common names that they, of course, call them because of the fact that they came out of Northern Europe. So-called Northmen, basically. So Norsemen, Norman, too, like the Normans and that settled in what is northern France, Normandy, as an example. The term Viking, though, was more derogatory, more like an insult than anything. And the term Viking was more like a term that meant they were like a pirate, bandit, buccaneer, that kind of thing. And of course, that's what most European Christians think of Vikings, more or less. These pirates that would come in and attack their cities, coastal towns would get raided by them. And so that stereotypical view of the Viking was something that was quite common at the time. And later, still is today, people still got that view of that. But most Vikings were really not all doing that. A lot of them were like great sailors. They were mostly farmers, most of them, Vikings. So it's more of a stereotype. And the whole thing you see in Hollywood where, they have movies and they have like horns on their helmets and stuff like that. That's actually not true. They didn't have horns on their helmets. That's something they kind of invented later. Looks great, but it's not really true about that. My daughter was talking about that the other, I think it was yesterday. She was talking about that. That's not true. It's like, oh, you serious? But anyway, a little bit about the Vikings. Why did they leave Scandinavia? What's the reason for why they left and all that? There's different theories on that, about why they left. One theory is that overpopulation had to do with it. If you know about that here, like Norway, etc., they have a lot of fjords and mountains, and so it's kind of hard to do stuff like farm and all that. Maybe you can fish and sail, but that's about it. So a lot of them left. Some people think it was caused by a warming period that happened because you have the medieval warm period that kind of comes in later that you have. Also, I think another theory they have is that had to do with the fact that in Europe, it was kind of more wealthier. They kind of like took advantage of that. And they attacked them, like to loot and take stuff from them. So that was another reason I think theorized about why they did it. In fact, they think that the first Vikings attacked the different parts of Europe was in northern Scotland. There's a place called Lindisfarne Island. You see it up there where it says 793 AD. That was actually the first place they attacked. And they first start going into different parts of like mostly in the northern part of Europe where they mostly attacked from like France to Russia overall. But they also went like Britain and other areas later. Viking culture, of course, was very warlike, very paganistic. Pretty much all the Vikings want to like die in battle and go to Viking heaven and stuff like that. And of course, they were known for different gods. Of course, their most famous god that they're famous for is, of course, Odin. You might have heard of. Odin was like basically the god of the warriors who lived at Asgard and Viking heaven. Suppose he lived in this great hall. There's an image of Odin, which may have been worshipped. They worshipped idols, evidently, of these gods and these images of these gods. And so, yeah, Odin was probably the most famous one and basically their chief god, kind of like a Zeus kind of god to them, or Jupiter. Also, they had Odin had another name. He was called Woden. You know about that, and it's kind of where we get the day of the week, Wednesday. Yeah, Wednesday is named after Odin. Means Odin's day. In fact, Thursday is named after Thor day. Yeah, Thor day, and Friday's Frey day. Yeah, so yeah, some of the days of the week named after the Vikings and all of that. You also got Thor as well. Yeah, Thor, of course, another god as well. That's also very famous. And Thor, of course, Thor is the god that is, of course, associated with thunder, as you know, and it says lightning storms and all that. But Odin had two sons. He had Thor, and he had also another son named Balder that he had as well. And of course, in mythology, Thor was the one that was associated with carrying a hammer. So it's called the hammer of the gods and all that overall. So you have that god as well. Frey, of course, was another god. Frey, of course, was a male god. The one Friday is named after, like I said. And Frey was associated with fertility, but also kingship. He had a sister named Freya. They were twins. And she was a Viking goddess associated with, you see, with love, beauty, sex, fertility. And basically, Freya was like a similar god to what would be like Aphrodite or Venus. So he's like the Viking god, similar to Aphrodite. Two other gods I'll give you real quick, too, were Loki as well, the trickster god. And then you have Balder, I told you, he was one of the sons of Odin as well. Loki was mostly a god associated with things like luck and fortune, etc., but also mischief. And then you got Balder, who was mostly associated with bravery, the god of bravery, they called him. But he was also associated with beauty and light as well. So those are all just different gods that, that the Vikings, worshiped overall. But the Vikings really, over time would convert to what is Christianity. So they would eventually switch to Christianity, and that would happen by the 11th century. They start converting over, and they think that's kind of what led to the end of the whole Viking Terra period, if you want to call it that, because they began settling down. Now, the Vikings also had ships that were well known, the so-called Viking ships. Those are called longships, or longship, that they were called because there was a long link to them, hence the nickname. And these were types of warships that were first built in Scandinavia during the Viking era, and they were known for their shallow drafts. They had the keel itself wasn't really underwater much, and so it allowed it to be a very swift and very fast type ship that could be used with sails. And then, of course, as you know, they were known for using oars as well. And in modern times, I'll show you a picture of a very famous ship that's well known, called the Iceberg Ship. Whereas there's right there, the Iceberg Ship. And the Iceberg Ship, of course, is well known for being one of the most famous Viking ships that survived from ancient times. And usually called Osborne Longship or Iceberg Ship, really. It was found around 1904. It was part of some kind of Viking funerary mound they found where it was buried, because the Vikings had this deal where they would take like a chieftain or a king and they would bury him in a ship, usually set it on fire, etc. And evidently they found this ship and reconstructed it. It's now in Oslo, in Norway. And these ships were very versatile. The Viking ships could sail almost anywhere. They could not just like seas and oceans. They could sail them up rivers. There's a case where the Vikings sailed like up the rivers of Russia, like the Don, the Dnieper, the Volga rivers, and all that. Lakes. They sailed into like multiple seas and oceans. I got here right here, but they went into like the North Atlantic. They think they may have crossed from like somehow eastern part of Atlantic all the way to where North America is, using these ships. Baltic Sea, Mediterranean Sea. From Russia, they went into the Black Sea, Caspian Seas also as well. So the Vikings were considered really the first great explorers in the world, before you get the modern explorers like Columbus that would come later, and all that. And what happened over time was the Vikings would eventually go on to settle different parts of Europe and also the North Atlantic. If you go to this map here, right here, you can see how the Vikings either raided or settled those areas that are all in different colors. Pretty much most of the northern part of Europe was attacked or settled by them at one point. And like in the North Atlantic, predominantly they went like into England, especially Eastern England, which for a long time the English called that area where the Danes lived, they call it the Dane law, because they're under their own Danish laws and all that. In fact, Alfred the Great, who was a king later in England, had to fight him off, if you know about that, because they tried to take over England. I think at one point they had a king of England that was, Danish. I think King Canute, I think his name was later, that they had. They settled part of Scotland and Ireland, you can see. And then, of course, you can see they also went into Iceland, and then later Greenland was also settled, of course, by the Vikings. There was a famous Viking named Eric the Red, who eventually went in and he colonized Greenland, which became a Viking settlement. And if you know about it, Eric, of course, was famous for coming up with the name Greenland. He coined it, trying to get people to go settle there. It was kind of a trick, if you know about this. And of course, Greenland's actually cold. It's like a huge, glacier, basically. And so he talked to people from, I guess, coming from Iceland or whatever to go settle there, but it's actually colder than Iceland. So that's why it's called Greenland. And then that was like that 980s, I think, when that happened. And then his son, a little later, Leif Ericsson, they're called Leif the Lucky sometimes, was a famous explorer right after his father that eventually went on a bunch of adventures to the west of Iceland and Greenland. And they believe that Leif was the one that they think discovered part of North America. Because if you know about the Vikings and all that, the Vikings would end up being one of the first Europeans to discover America, which they would close to 1000 CE, like about 1020 years ago, basically. And this was like 500 years before Columbus would come later. They believe that because of what Leif had done with discovering part of what they think is Canada, the Vikings would try to create a permanent settlement there sometime right afterwards, which became known as, they called it Vinland in a lot of famous Viking stories, like the Vinland sagas. I think it survived from that time, or the Icelandic sagas, I think was another name they called it as well. And anyway, Vinland or Wineland, they called it different names, was the name that they eventually called it because of supposedly wild grapes that grew there. So they made wine out of. And over time, it was a permanent settlement. But what happened was the Vikings came into conflict with the Native Americans that lived in that part of Canada, like Eastern Canada. They called them Skreelings or something like that. But I think it's theorized that they were somehow related or descended from the Iroquois and other types of Indians that'll be there, like the Huron, that are kind of in that area later in Eastern Canada. And they left because of it. The conflict was too much, I guess, for them. And so they abandoned Vinland. And so no Europeans really came back until really the late 15th century overall. So that's kind of like the Vikings at that point, trying to take over. I'm just about out of time with this lecture today overall. So I think I'm going to cut this lecture right now. That's pretty much it for today. But I'll finish up talking about the Viking period on Friday. Actually, I'm going to have a lecture on Friday, which I'll go into I'm really concentrate more on the High Middle Ages coming up, more or less, because I need to cover like the period of the Crusades. I'll also talk about the period of the Mongols. The Mongol invasion is going to come in around the 13th century. So I'll talk about that mostly as well. So pretty much get into the High Middle Ages is my next topic lecture-wise on the Middle Ages. But before I go, don't forget, you do have a bunch of assignments that are due of course, in quizzes and also in assignments on Canvas. So make sure you take a look at that. I will be, of course, keep reminding you about assignments that are out there through various emails I've sent out to you. But if you have any questions later about this lecture that I've streamed and recorded for you for today, make sure you go back and look at that, because These lectures I'm doing now on the Roman Empire in the Middle Ages are all going to go towards, of course, your final exam, which is coming up at the end of the month. So it's not that far away. We only have really 2 more lecture days left, pretty much, for me to do this Friday and, of course, Monday next week, and that's pretty much it. So that's it for today. Y'all take care, and I'll, of course, have a lecture for you later overall. So y'all take care. Have a good rest of the week.